Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
You will observe that many people, and certainly governments at this point, is caught between a very big rock and a very hard place. Because there's two different things going on. The one is there's a virus out there that's making a lot of people ill, and that would make a lot more people ill if we didn't lock down somehow. And on the other hand, there is a massive economic slowdown happening that is threatening to really destroy the economic lives and prosperity of countries and companies and people. So a very, very difficult situation out there. But I think the more difficult the situation is, the more important it is to kind of make sense of what's happening and to have a look at what might happen in future and why that might unfold. So if you look around you, you will see that roughly 2/3 of the world's population at this point is caught in some fairly serious form of lockdown, meaning that they're not allowed to actually come out of their homes except for specific purposes, and that those purposes in general are quite limited. And really, in most places, it's only essential businesses that are allowed to operate. So if you're producing food and distributing food, you're allowed to operate, and very little else is allowed to operate, except for hospitals, which are gearing up for the worst, or in some places experiencing the worst. So a very unusual situation, something that none of us have actually come across in our lifetimes, and hopefully we never come across this type of situation again in our lifetimes. So up to now, I've, in this talk, spent quite a bit of time on talking about how the virus operates, etc. I think that's now general knowledge. I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. The one thing that I do want to kick off with is the idea of flattening the curve. So we know that the virus spreads, and if we lock down, we can slow the spread of the virus or even stop the spread of the virus. So what will happen is that you will, especially at the start of the lockdowns, you would have heard a lot about flattening the curve. So you should be seeing a very steep red bubble and a much flatter blue bubble on your screens. That's really the idea of flattening the curve. So what you can see there, it's not very clear on this graph, but there, where it says healthcare system capacity, that's what they look at. They say we've got a certain capacity to deal with cases, and what we see worldwide is that there's a reasonable death rate for people who actually test positive for the virus, but in places where the health system gets overwhelmed, we actually see that the death rate roughly doubles. So the idea is to say you've got to keep the epidemic at such a rate that it doesn't overwhelm your medical system, and then you will have many fewer deaths. So flattening the curve is the mantra at the beginning of the lockdowns. So you see roughly what they mean here is they say that if we had half what we would have in an uncontrolled environment, we'd flatten the curve and we wouldn't overwhelm our health resources. The problem is that's actually not a very realistic representation of what happens. What actually happens, you can see on the next graph, if we can go on to that next graph, what you see is that if you have various curves, some slower and some faster, depending on how you lock down, you are in any case way above that bottom red line. So you'll see that red line just above the bottom. That's the actual ability to care for people who are critically ill. So in most countries, it looks like this, which means that if you have any kind of serious epidemic, you, in any country in the world, basically, you overwhelm your ability to deal with it. So lockdown is not really about flattening the curve anymore. It's much more about eliminating the curve. Because if you flatten the curve by half or by 3/4, you still overwhelm your medical resources. So if you just do the simple sum, the latest statistics we have is that if we let the virus spread, it will probably infect 80% of people. So typically for a flu virus, you get 60 to 70% of people eventually get infected by that flu virus. Because there's no existing immunity to the coronavirus in the community, it's likely that the level to which this goes is actually 80%. So if you look at a country like South Africa, you say, well, there's roughly 50 million people, so if 80% of people get infected, that's 40 million people. If 20% of those people have to go to hospital, that's 8 million people in hospital. If 5 of the 20, meaning roughly 2 million, have to go into intensive care and need a ventilator, that means you've actually got 2 million people needing ventilators, and you've got 3,000 ventilators in the country. So it gives you an idea of the off-the-charts nature of what would happen if you just let the virus run through your economy. So part of what we'll discuss is whether it's actually even possible to prevent the virus from eventually running through your system. But what it means is that in most developed countries, the idea of flattening the curve is actually to get back to a point where you are under the red line, and then to keep your lockdown at a point where you don't exceed that bottom red line, which means that you basically have to stay in some fairly serious form of lockdown. Otherwise, you get a resurgence and you again overwhelm your health system. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. So let's just maybe go back to what's happening in proper developed countries. So can we go to the graph for Korea, please? So in South Korea, they actually caught the virus fairly early on, and they had a surge of infections. So you can see the graph there. It spikes towards the end of March. Well, actually the beginning of March. Let me put on my glasses so I can see where it was. At the beginning of March, we have a spike, and then what you see is that spike fades and becomes a very flat line. So why does that happen? So this is now a developed country. Remember now, South Korea, it has been, at least for the last 20 years, classified as a developed economy. So it's a developed economy with a strong tradition of social control by the government. So it's actually, if you think about the chances of enforcing a strict lockdown, there's a combination of how developed is the country and how strong is the tradition of actually enforcing policy from the government. Now, South Korea qualifies on both of those counts, so it's about as developed as we get. And what you see is the result there is that they had a bit of a spike because they didn't act before the virus came along. They brought it under control very quickly, and they've kept it under control. So that's what's supposed to happen in developed countries. In some developed countries, it's actually even better than this. So if you were New Zealand, and we don't have figures for New Zealand today, but if you were New Zealand, you actually have, we can go off the graph for a moment. If you're New Zealand, you actually acted very early. So Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, said, here's a big problem. Let's actually lock down before we get a lot of infections. Why didn't we need to get infections first and then lock down? So what they did is they locked down before infections really got going. And they're now at the point that they are seriously considering whether they can eliminate the virus completely on the island of New Zealand. Effectively, Jacinda Ardern is saying we may in a month's time start the rugby season with spectators because there will be no one infected with the virus on the New Zealand island. So again, if you're a developed country and you're an island and you're a small nation, you may consider trying to eliminate the virus completely on the island. Of course, that doesn't bring you out of the damaged area in terms of the effects of the virus, because if you're New Zealand, roughly a little bit more than 10% of your economy is tourism from foreign tourists. So obviously, if you've eliminated the virus on your island, you're not going to allow the tourists in. So at least 10% of your economy is disabled anyway, even though you have zero infections in your country. So that's the basic plan, is you lock down and then you keep the virus from spreading. And what that implies from a lockdown situation is that you have a very strict initial lockdown, and then you move on to some more sustainable situation where you allow more economic activity, but in a very controlled fashion, so as to make sure that the virus doesn't spread again. So that's the story for developed economies, and we'll go back in a second to what that means for economics. However, there are also a lot of developing countries around the world, and also developing countries with little tradition of civil obedience. So if you think about civil obedience, a place like Sweden has elected not to lock down from a legal perspective, meaning not that they didn't slow their economy down, but what they did is that everything they did was voluntary. So the Prime Minister of Sweden asked Swedes to please take care. These are the characteristics of the virus. This is how you would slow it down. Please don't take any actions that would allow the virus to spread. And Swedes, on the whole, have been reacting to that by staying at home, not mixing with each other, and practicing social distancing. So there's been severe economic disruption as well in Sweden, but not as severe as in other places. And the basic idea in Sweden was to say they reacted quickly. So this message from the Prime Minister of Sweden went out quite early, so they never had the initial spike in infections. And what they did from the start is to say, we're only going to take actions that we can sustain for a long period of time. So we're not going to go into a lockdown that is essentially temporary. And in Sweden, that seems to be working reasonably well, except that what we are seeing is that there does seem to be a fairly severe epidemic eventually developing in Sweden, despite of the Swedish People's Cooperation. You see the same thing in Holland. The Prime Minister said, we will treat our people like adults, meaning if you think that you can play golf without getting too close to other people, not make it a contact sport, by all means go out and play golf. So if you think about golf for 3 seconds, as long as you're playing golf with people that are living in your own household in the first place, and secondly, you're not visiting the clubhouse, there's really no reason why you shouldn't be playing golf. But in terms of a strict lockdown, what happens is that you say, well, we can't really trust people to exercise their own discretion. We've got to tell them what to do, and the only thing we can tell them to do that we can really strictly enforce is to stay at home and not get out of their houses, unless they are part of the essential economy, if you like. So in countries where you don't have this long tradition of civil cooperation and obedience, like Sweden and Holland, it's very, very difficult to enforce even a very strict lockdown. So what's happening is that we're seeing a country like Brazil, we're seeing a very, very fast spread of the virus and virus illnesses, partly because the president of Brazil has elected not to do anything, and the governors of some of the states in Brazil have announced lockdowns, But without the support of the federal government, those lockdowns have not been very effective. But what one would say about Brazil is they don't have a long tradition of civil cooperation, and they don't actually have a highly developed economy. So they have a lot of poor people living in very close quarters with each other, with very little sanitary facilities. So it's unlikely that even if Brazil had tried, that it could have enforced a strict lockdown to the extent that that the virus would have been unable to spread. Now, in South Africa, we've seen that Cyril Ramaphosa, the president, also with Jacinda Ardern, acted quickly before we actually had an epidemic. So at the time that he acted, we had a couple of imported cases of fairly wealthy people who had gone skiing in Europe, who brought the virus back with them. And so we went into early lockdown. And realistically, I have to say that the Minister of Health, even at the time, said that we understand that we cannot eliminate the virus in South Africa. All we can do is we can buy ourselves some time to get ready for the epidemic when it hits us. And if we can go to the graph of South African infections, you will see that unlike New Zealand and South Korea, where the virus cases virtually were eliminated after the lockdown, you see that in spite of the very severest lockdown that's possible to enforce in South Africa, we now have an exponential expansion in the curve for coronavirus cases. So in essence, the virus is out there in the general community. The general community does not have the facility to lock down strictly enough to not infect each other. So we're seeing cases rise very rapidly. And what you have to say is that the probability is we're only seeing this amount of cases because we have a lack of testing capacity. We're also seeing that deaths are increasing. You'll see that as well. But the deaths are still fairly limited. It's a couple of hundred at this point. In places where you have a severe epidemic, you have 1,000 deaths a day. That's what we saw in New York about a month ago. But what you can say is that if you look at this graph, it's highly likely that in 2 months' time, we'll be at the 1,000 deaths a day situation in South Africa. Because even though we tried very hard to enforce the lockdown has not been effective at preventing the spread. It has been effective at slowing the spread of the virus. So what you have to say is that hospitals and the medical system in South Africa have had ample warning and ample time to prepare. So there are more ventilators being brought into hospitals every day. There are temporary hospitals being set up, etc. So there's a much greater readiness for this. But at the same time, you have to say that if we get the number of infections that's likely, it's still likely that our health system will be overwhelmed and that a lot of people will get ill and a lot of people will die. And now we have to also get back to one other thing, and that is the virus doesn't really discriminate. If you're the Prime Minister of Britain, it doesn't say, I'll pass you by. You get infected and you come very close to dying. It's very clear that if Boris Johnson didn't have very good medical care, he would have died of the virus. So it's likely that if he caught this virus in some favela in Brazil, he would have died. Because the kind of care that he got at St. Thomas's Hospital would not have been available to him. So if you're a poor person in South Africa, and you get this virus 2 months from now and you're slightly susceptible, then you are probably in grave danger. So that's just, that's not a prediction, but it's just an assessment of where we stand as South Africa. So we can move on from South Africa. So in essence, what we see in the world is that most countries, when they either become aware of the presence of the virus or they see a lot of their own people becoming infected, they see the hospitals coming under pressure, will go into some form of strict lockdown. So Italy is a country that was regarded as an unlikely place to have a strict lockdown. When enough people in Italy got ill, they actually locked down very seriously. They had a very serious epidemic. A lot of people died. The medical system was overwhelmed. Even the system of burying people or cremating them got overwhelmed. So they were unable to elegantly deal with the number of bodies that was being generated by the epidemic. But in the end, it's likely that only about between 10 and 20% of people in Italy has been infected. So the lockdown in Italy worked to the extent that the new admissions to hospitals are now under control, the death rate is under control, but they have only got immunity in 10 to 20% of the population. And the statistics say that you need at least 60 to 70% of the people in your system to have some form of immunity to control the spread of a new epidemic. So Italy is now out on the other side of their epidemic, or they are at least on the downslope of the epidemic, but they don't have enough immunity in the community to really open their economy up. So what they're likely to do is to stay in some form of slightly relaxed lockdown, but actually still quite a strict level of lockdown, because what you need is you need to reduce contact to the level that prevents the spread. So what we're also seeing in a place like New York is now also on the other side, the falling side of their epidemic. So deaths are falling. They're not only reporting about 300 deaths a day rather than 1,000 deaths a day that they're reporting a month ago. And they are starting to think about how they will reopen their economy. Now, again, in the US, the whole question of opening up is not really that controlled by the federal government. It's controlled by the states. And New York, you have a very responsible governor who says, I'm reluctant to start opening up because I don't want this to come back. And again, they've started testing for immunity to the coronavirus in New York, and they're seeing that in New York State as a whole, they're getting about 14% of people have some form of immunity. In New York City itself, about 20% of people have some form of immunity. So again, they're about a quarter of the way to so-called herd immunity, which means that once they come out of the strict lockdown, they will still need to keep the virus under control. They will not be able to open up completely. So this has led to the concept of the 90% economy. Now, those of you who are followers of The Economist, the most informative magazine in the world, British magazine, their front page last week was the 90% economy. And what they mean is that what we're actually seeing is when you go into the strict lockdown, you eliminate roughly 30% of GDP. So in the period that you're in strict lockdown, and for most countries, that's a period of somewhere between 1 month and 3 months of really strict lockdown, roughly 30% of GDP disappears. Now, just to give you a reference point, at the height of the credit crunch of 2008, which was the worst recession since the 1930s, we lost about 5% of GDP for a short period of time in developed countries. So this is 6 times worse from an economic point of view than the credit crunch of 2008. So this is really, really something completely unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this at all. And so the idea then is that if you could eliminate the virus or flatten the curve to the extent that you get immunity within a 3 to 4 month period, that would be fine. You'd lose this for a while, and then the economy would go back to 100% and normality would return from an economic point of view. The problem is that's not actually what happens. After the strict lockdown, you actually go back to a situation where at least 10% of your economic production is eliminated. So in some countries, as I say, New Zealand, just the elimination of tourism already takes more than 10% of your economic activity away. But if you just think about travel, tourism, flights, etc., those are things that can't come back in the second stage of lockdown. You still have to eliminate those, and you still have to eliminate the gathering of large crowds. So sport with spectators are unlikely to resume under the second stage of lockdown. So if you're thinking about strict lockdown is when you don't have Wimbledon, you cancel it. Apparently the cancellation of Wimbledon this year was a real setback for Roger Federer. He thought that this year would be his last chance, given that he's 38, to actually win Wimbledon another time. And the fact that we're now not going to see Wimbledon this year has eliminated that possibility. So, but next year, when we get around to Wimbledon, in a situation where we're in the 90% phase, if we're still in the 90% phase at that point, then Wimbledon will take place. All the players, umpires, ball boys, etc., will be tested on a regular basis. So everybody would be tested every day, and any positive person would be eliminated from participating. But there will be no spectators, because the spectators would be spreading the virus among themselves. And then you might get to a stage where the spectators will be allowed in, but they'd have to sit 2 meters from each other. So you might actually get a quarter of the spectators that you would normally have at a next stage of Wimbledon. So that's a little bit of what the 90% economy is about. So the first part of it is also that you don't go from the 70% economy, because remember now, in most places in the world, right now, we find ourselves in the 70% phase. So Germany, Italy, Britain, the bulk of the United States, India, the bulk of China, etc. All of those countries are still in the very strict stage of lockdown. So we're losing about 30% of GDP in all of those countries. And then we're likely to very slowly move towards an 80 to 85% economy. So if most of these countries have now announced stages of unlocking, so in South Africa, we've got 5 stages. I think we're overcomplicating it. Tony Blair Foundation only recommended 3 stages of lockdown, but never mind. What will happen is that only very limited amounts of activity will be allowed in the second stage, meaning the first stage of unlocking, if you like. And what you're likely to see is that you're unlocking those things where there isn't a lot of social mingling. Meaning, if you are working in a factory where you're more than 2 meters from your colleague and everybody's wearing masks, you might go back to work with reasonably low risk. So that would be allowed. But if you go into your hairdresser, you're in very intimate contact with your hairdresser for quite a long time. So even if you're wearing masks, it's unlikely that you're distancing quite enough. So hairdressers will probably not open very soon. A lot of you'll get stages of reopening. One of the big debates is whether schools should be allowed to open. The argument there is that children are actually not very susceptible to the coronavirus, therefore we should allow them back. The problem is that they do get infected and that they go visit their grandparents, who then get infected and actually die. So opening schools is not an easy decision either. But so there's, first of all, a risk-adjusted opening of various activities. And then secondly, what you get is you actually get things where they say, let's think about the damage that's being done by not opening up. And if the damage is great, then even if it's a fairly high risk, we'll open up. And I think schools actually fall into that category. So it is assumed that the damage to children of not going to school is quite severe. and therefore they will allow children to go back to schools at a fairly early stage, not because it's a less risky activity, because small children especially won't be very good at social distancing, but because the damage to the children are so large. So there's lots of arguments about how that works. Just one other point about the 90% economy is that the first reason why it's a 90% economy is 10% of economic activity is prohibited. The second problem that you're then going to have in this 90% economy is that it's actually quite difficult to produce in this 90% economy, because you now have to provide everybody with protective equipment so that they don't infect each other. And you have to test people when they come onto your site, or at least screen them. Ideally, you should be testing them, but testing capacity is still under tremendous strain. So we're not at the stage where everybody can just get on with it. Even if you do open, you open at limited capacity. And I see that Spur, for instance, have said they will not reopen until full capacity is allowed, because limited capacity is actually more of a problem in a Spur than closing it altogether, because you have to have people manning the whole operation, but you can't get enough turnover to make a profit. So, so there's a lot of difficulty in production, and your cost of production will go up significantly. So one of the things we've seen, for instance, is that Amazon's volumes have gone up greatly, but they haven't reported fantastic results because the cost of doing business has gone up so much, because they now have to protect people at work. So what we see is an initial very severe downturn, then followed by a prolonged period of increasing economic activity, going back from 70% roughly to 90%, but with great difficulty. So that's the immediate situation, and we can see the extent of that from the jobless numbers and the growth numbers that's being reported. So initially we just made a thumbs-up estimate. What we're seeing now is some economic numbers coming through that gives us indication of what's actually happening during the lockdown. We'll only see the real numbers for the third quarter of 2020 in about 3 months' time, so it will take a while to really get a hold of what this is, and then initially the measurements is likely to be fairly inaccurate. But what we're seeing here is, if you look at the graph that's up now, the unemployment rate since 1929 in the United States. So you can see that the highest that unemployment went was in 1982. The second highest that unemployment went after the Great Depression was in 2009, and it peaked out at 10%. We are now dealing with estimates of unemployment of 16% during April. We know that the numbers that have claimed for new unemployment is actually up to 30 million already. So we're likely to see that number go over 20%. So that gives you an idea of the extent to which things grind to a halt. Now, the question that really arises now from an investment point of view is not only how deep is the damage right at this point, but also what the how long lasting will the damage be? And the answer is that we can't come out of the 90% economy until we have some form of herd immunity, meaning at least 60 to 70% of people have some form of resistance to the virus, either because they've already been infected with the virus or they've been vaccinated in some way. Can I ask everybody to just actually mute their microphones, because we're picking up some sound in the background. So the question becomes, how long lasting is this? And my conclusion is that we actually in this at least until roughly the middle of next year. So the 90% economy is likely to last for about a year. So we'll have roughly 6 months of the very strict lockdown. Then what will happen is in some places the relaxation will go too far. So we hear now from places in the US where they're opening hairdressers and barbershops, etc., way before the virus is under control. So it's very likely that in those places there'll be another serious bout of the epidemic. And if you get that serious bout of the epidemic, it's very likely that governments will put that part of the economy back into very strict lockdown. So we'll have a period during which you go from fairly strict lockdown to very strict lockdown, back to very fairly serious lockdown, depending on the level of the infections that you get in various countries or in various locations. But that period is likely to last for about 12 months because that's the soonest that we can realistically expect a vaccination to be available. So the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, they're already busy with human trials of potential vaccines. In fact, I know of about 7 different human trials of different potential vaccines. But even if those trials are successful, the point at which you can produce billions of these vaccines in order to vaccinate the bulk of the world's population is at least 12 months away. So it's unlikely that we can get out of some form of lockdown before 12 months have passed from now. So we're likely to endure the 90% economy in some form for about 12 months. Part of what's likely to happen is that in some places the virus will come back and be more virulent, if you like, and then they will have to go back to stricter lockdown. But in other places, they will find smarter and smarter ways to operate safely, and therefore the 90% economy might become a 95% economy in some places where people are really smart. That goes for developed countries that are able to lock down. In developing countries like South Africa that are not able to maintain a strict enough lockdown to eliminate the spread of the virus, we'll have a very different situation. We will acquire herd immunity because many people will be infected. So what you're likely to see is that over roughly a 3 to 4 month period, somewhere between 60 and 80% of the population will actually be infected by the virus, and the population will acquire herd immunity, meaning in South Africa, we will probably see the peak of the epidemic in roughly July, August. And by October this year, the virus cases, the illnesses will start fading. And by the end of the year, we'll be back to normality pretty much because virtually everybody will have been infected with the virus and either died or recovered. So the virus will no longer be a real problem in South Africa. The problem, of course, that you'll have is no one else in the developed world, at least, will want to come to South Africa for instance, tourism, because it will be known as a place with a widespread virus infection. And therefore, we will still not be able to get back to a really normal economy, but most daily activities will return to normal roughly by early next year in a place like South Africa, most likely. And the same will go for Brazil, and the same will go for India. I'd like to just show you one more graph about how deep the current slowdown is. So we're seeing some weekly monitoring of so it's a guesstimate of what GDP is doing in the United States. And there you can see that graph falling through the normal ways that you would that you would do these graphs. And we're seeing that GDP is probably contracting by about 15 to 20% per annum right now in the US. The estimates differ. Most estimates, the Tony Blair Foundation says about 25%. Some people say as much as 35%, but it doesn't really matter. A very large portion of the economy is standing still. So the next question is, how does this now affect investments? And the first thing to start with is to say, let's have a look at what has happened to the world's stock markets. So if we look at the MECI World Stock Index, we will see that there was a massive downdraft in the index, and it's the fastest bear market in history, meaning the time that it took from the top to fall more than 20% was a record short time. So it was a very precipitous fall of about 35%. And then there was some fairly serious intervention by the authorities. The Federal Reserve started buying all kinds of unconventional securities, and roughly $3 trillion of stimulus has come in from the US government. So markets actually reacted very positively to that, and we see that the market at the moment is down only about 20% from the top. So that gives us an idea of what's happened. Quite a strong downdraft, but then actually quite a strong updraft again. So if you look at the technical definition of a bull market is actually 20% up from the bottom. So we already more than 20% up from the bottom. So that means we've had a bear market and a bull market all in 2 months' time. So we now need to assess what the future of this is. And a key part of that assessment is, what is the situation of the world when we get back to normal? So in terms of the virus, once we get back to normal, do we just go back to the old normality quickly, which means a V-shaped situation, meaning a very sharp downdraft in activity and a very sharp uptick in activity? Or is there some lingering problems in the economy? And I come down very strongly on the side of people who think that we will come out of this once the virus is behind us and there is a vaccine or there is herd immunity in some form for the world. We will come out in a very deep recession. And the reason for that deep recession is that if we just analyze the balance sheets of the main actors in the economy, you will see that they will all be under severe pressure. So the first starting point is to say, what will consumers be doing when we get back to normality? So the first thing consumers will do is those people who are working for companies that are still open and want all of their workers back will go back to work very eagerly. So people will be very eager to participate because they will have been without income or with limited income for quite a while. So effectively, consumers fall into three categories. There are those who are not affected, who can work from home or are part of an essential industry and are still getting their normal income, but actually can't spend at their normal level, so they are accumulating a little bit of cash, probably 20 to 30% in that category. Then you see a category where people are under some form of pressure. They are being sent home and they're getting less income than normal. So some people are getting 80%, some people are getting 50%, and so on. And then you get people who have lost their jobs and have either very limited income or no income at all. So if you were to think of someone who was washing cars in the basement before the lockdown came, 100% of their income has now disappeared. So they are forced to stay at home and they have zero income. So what happens to 70% of people is they're very eager to get back to work because they want to get some money in order to be able to buy essentials again, but they are also very eager to fix their balance sheets, meaning they've used up whatever cash they've had, they've taken up whatever loans they can take up, so they now have to repay their debt and rebuild their cash. So they will be very eager producers, but not very eager consumers. They will save as much as they can. So the average for consumers would be that they will come back extremely cautiously on the whole. The same thing goes for companies. So the companies also fall into those three categories. There are the companies that are doing even better than normal, the Zooms of the world. Then you have a lot of companies who are still having some level of activity, people working from home, etc., but they experience some form of bleeding. They are cutting salaries, they're cutting staff, and they are using their cash reserves and they're taking up their credit facilities. So we know that the banks in South Africa are inundated with loan applications from all kinds of businesses who want to just borrow money in order to survive through the lockdown period. So what happens to those companies? They come out of the lockdown, but they have very large debts and no cash. And therefore, again, they're very eager participants in production, but they're not actually eager to invest. They first want to rebuild their balance sheets. And then, of course, you probably have about 30% of companies who can't survive this. So we know that in China, in the first quarter of the year alone, 460,000 businesses went bankrupt. So about 30% of businesses will probably go bankrupt unless they are bailed out. We know, for instance, if you look at airlines, very badly affected because no one's flying. In South Africa, we already had SAA in business rescue, but we now also have Comair in business rescue because their cash resources have been exhausted. And the same will happen to airports around the world. So basically, roughly 30% of the capacity doesn't come back quickly because the companies have gone bankrupt, and therefore you have to start from scratch. You can't just go back to your old job because that job no longer exists. So, so the balance sheets of companies also under great pressure. So very low business confidence, very low consumer confidence. And then also you see that governments will have been spending a lot of money on relief. So in South Africa, we've had a 500 billion rand relief package. That's about 10% of GDP. Plus, we see the collapse of income. So we lose another about 500 billion rands in lost income through tax not being collected. So in South Africa, we're likely to see the national debt exceeding 100% of GDP by the end of the crisis, meaning governments will also be under pressure in some form to reduce their debt and fix their balance sheet. So what we see is that we believe is a very severe recession, and governments will have to actually intervene in spite of their high levels of debt. They will have to spend a lot of money in order to get the economy going again. But what they will do at the end of the story is to try to actually invest into infrastructure to get back to some form of normal economic activity. So the medical analogy is that you initially put the patient into an induced coma. So that's what happens with lockdown. Then you have to put some glucose drips on. So you've got to keep the patient alive while he's lying in bed. This is now all the relief packages that we're seeing. It's just putting money into the hands of vulnerable people so they can buy food. And then eventually you'll get back to the situation where you can actually give your client or your patient some steroids, which will allow him to build muscle again once he gets up out of bed. So we actually believe that from 2022 onwards, there'll be massive round of infrastructure investment going in worldwide in order to try to rebuild the economies.